Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about energy for muscle contraction. Initially, muscles are going to use ATP for energy. That's not very surprising to you if you've taken general biology with me, which you all have. Muscles store ATP up when they're not being used so that they can use it when they need it. You break the bonds of ATP to release energy, and when you do that, ATP becomes adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and it becomes inorganic phosphate. That's P lowercase I. Yeah, these two separate. And when they separate, they release a lot of energy. The sad thing about it is you only have about 4 to 6 seconds worth of ATP stored up in your muscles. So if you're lifting something very, very heavy, and let's say it's as heavy as you can possibly lift, and you lift it a couple of times, and you take 6 or 7 seconds to do this, your body is going to start to look at alternative ways to make energy because you've used up all the ATP that those muscles had stored in them. Because in our last lecture, you saw that it takes a lot of ATP to make those little myosin cross bridges work. And we're going to burn through it pretty quick. So after this initial time, we got to look at some other pathways to make ATP because we can't run out of ATP or else we can't move our muscles. So the easiest way to do this is called direct phosphorylation. And this is just the most simple, logical thing you could possibly do. You take ADP, adenosine diphosphate, you give it a phosphate group, and you make ATP. It's perfect. It's very, very simple. You get that from a chemical called creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is something, I'm not recommending it, but it's something that you could buy. They sell creatine powders in you know, I don't know, vitamin supplement, weightlifting powder guy, gal kind of thing. I don't know if it's really that good or for you or not, but there you have it. Creatine phosphate, the reason people take this when they're lifting is because it phosphorylates ADP and it makes more ATP and you have more energy for lifting. The creatine phosphate gives its phosphate group to ADP. That's how ATP is regenerated. And this is going to be completely exhausted in about 20 seconds. And so, we started with 6 seconds of stored up energy. If you have plenty of creatine phosphate in you, you can add 20 to that. So we're at about 26 seconds worth of using a muscle for about all it can be used for. So not a lot of energy in muscles at this point. So what if we continue to use a muscle past the point where it it starts to lose ATP and lose oxygen? If we're working very hard, running very hard, we have the potential to go down a few of these paths. Now, regardless of whether you're exhausted or you haven't worked out at all, you will still do glycolysis. Everything does glycolysis. Even like yeast and bacteria do glycolysis. And glycolysis is the first reaction in a series of steps to make energy out of food. And what it does is it breaks down glucose, and it does not require oxygen to do this. It happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Glucose is broken down to two chemicals called pyruvic acid, and it produces a little bit of ATP, not a lot, about 2 net ATP, because it actually costs 2 ATP to get this thing started. And if you had a good Gen Bio experience, you might remember that, or you might not. Pyruvic acid, if we don't have oxygen, like we've been running or lifting so, I don't know what you would call it, been running or lifting so intensely that you're actually running out of oxygen, we will start to convert this to lactic acid, and that's what's going to cause your muscles to burn. So, anaerobic glycolysis, it's not very efficient, but it is really fast. Bad things about it, it takes a lot of glucose, And if you go ahead and produce lactic acid, that's what's going to cause muscles to burn and muscles to feel very fatigued. So let's say you do have oxygen. Glucose to pyruvic acid still does not require oxygen, but pyruvic acid into the mitochondria is what happens when you do have oxygen. Now, this is going to be a really good thing. If you're not completely worn out from exercising and there's plenty of oxygen in you, you can continue to do what's called aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration is going to give us the most ATP out of one glucose we could possibly get. And it's a series of pathways that occur in the mitochondria. That's this guy down here, the powerhouse of the cell, I'm sure you all know. Glucose is broken down into carbon dioxide and water and releases energy. And this is a much slower reaction. But from this reaction, you can get 36 ATP per glucose. That is a huge number compared to glycolysis gives you 2, lactic acid fermentation only gives you 2, aerobic respiration gives you 36. It's a huge energy payday. So aerobic respiration is what we want to do. We just can't always do it because sometimes we run out of oxygen when we're working out and we can't make the most energy that we possibly could because we're working too hard currently. So, what happens when a muscle gets fatigued? When a muscle is fatigued, it can't contract, or it can't contract nearly as well as it used to contract. And the common reason for this is what we call oxygen debt, which means basically you've worked really hard, lifting, running, something like that. And when you work really hard, you run out of oxygen and you go into lactic acid fermentation. It doesn't make a lot of energy, but it makes enough energy to keep the muscle cell alive. And now you're in what's called the oxygen debt. And you have to actually repay that oxygen debt to your muscle tissue in order to get enough oxygen to switch back into aerobic respiration and replenish this ATP. The other thing you're going to need that oxygen for is it is going to help you metabolize lactic acid. This can take a while. When you're running hard or working hard, that lactic acid fermentation that you switch to gives you the 2 ATP from glycolysis, but also gives you lactic acid as the byproduct. And that lactic acid is actually stored in your muscle tissue. And it hurts, and your muscles hurt, and it's not very much fun. But as you breathe and rest and take a day off, your muscles are still going to be sore the next day, but with enough oxygen and time, that lactic acid will be metabolized and broken down, and your legs and arms won't be sore anymore. But that can take a little while. Increasing acidity from the lactic acid and the lack of ATP causes the muscle to contract less. Basically, you won't jump as high when you're sore and exhausted as you will before your long, intense workout. No duh, right? Okay, so there's a couple different types of ways to contract a muscle, which is so weird because we would really only think of one, but there are two. The first is isotonic. We're going to change this color. Let's do this one. The first is isotonic. Isotonic contractions are when myofilaments slide past each other during contractions. Basically, everything I showed you in the video's last lecture, that's what isotonic is. The muscle actually shortens, okay? If you squat, or you leg press, or you curl, or you bench, or you do anything in the weight room that I'm sure your PE coach has you doing at some point, you are doing isotonic contractions. Lots and lots and lots of them. But that's not the only type of muscle contraction. There's also isometric. Isometric contractions are where we increase muscle tension, but the muscle doesn't get any shorter because it can't. Think of taking a really heavy weight and holding it over your head. And you just like lock your elbows and hold it above your head. Muscles aren't getting much shorter really. maybe a little tiny bit in the tricep. Um, but your deltoids, your shoulders are going to get tired. Your hands are going to get tired. Your biceps are going to get tired. Um, and they're not shortening. It's isometric. They're basically stabilizing. You could think of the same thing if you were to lock both of your arms and push against a wall as hard as you can. Your muscles aren't shortening, but you will still get very tired. It's an isometric contraction. So there are two different types of contractions, and only one causes muscles to really shorten. So it can be a little confusing because you can kind of ask yourself, how is it a contraction if something's not getting shorter? It can be kind of a tricky thing. So let's talk muscle tone. This is an easy one. Even in a relaxed muscle, you just sitting in a laptop listening to a anatomy lecture, some fibers are still contracted in relaxed muscles. All over your body, some fibers are contracted. And that's what gives us muscle tone. Different fibers contract at different times so that certain muscle fibers don't become fatigued from you just sitting here or typing or writing or something like that. We talked about motor units. If we fire at different motor units at different times, they kind of share the load of providing muscle tone. The process of stimulating various fibers, this is actually under involuntary control. You don't have to think about things like your posture or moving your arm, writing, typing. I mean, you think about them, but the muscle tone that controls all of the muscles of your body, the fact that your feet are where they are on the floor, that's from muscle tone in your calves and your quads and all over your body. Of little muscle fibers that are being stimulated all the time to control that sort of stuff. So, movement. So the movement, which we're going to be very concerned with here in our next lecture, is because a muscle is attached to a movable bone. Okay, so here we have our humerus, here we have our ulna. This is, I don't know, biceps, brachii, brachioradialis, something like that. And we originate somewhere, we call it the origin. We insert somewhere, we call that the insertion. And then when the muscle shortens, all it can do is pull on this tendon and lift this ulna up, and it would flex at the elbow, and we would call that its action. Now, if you decide to pursue science, there's going to become a day in your life where you got to learn origins, insertion, and actions for like pretty much all the muscles in the body. That day's not today. It would just take this chapter, make this chapter take a lot longer. We're going to learn actions though. We are going to learn muscles and actions. So there's your 2 points, the origin and the assertion, attaching to a movable bone, attaching to an immovable bone. You can be the judge there if that makes sense to you. I just learned origins and insertions, but in my head, I can move my humerus, and I can also move my ulna. So I don't know if movable and immovable really work for you, but if they do, great. So what if we exercise? I mean, does it really actually do anything? Is it beneficial for muscle fibers? The answer is yeah. Results of increased muscle use if you're using your muscles frequently in sports or a weight room or some sort of extracurricular deal. Increased muscle size. You can't make more muscle fibers. It doesn't work that way. It's not like they divide and become increase in number. It's not like a really, really strong guy has twice as many muscle fibers as a not so strong guy. But you can make them swollen. Um, when you lift, muscle fibers will become just a little bit larger. And if every muscle fiber swells up just a little bit, then of course the whole muscle that you see becomes just a little bit larger. They will also increase muscle strength, meaning they'll be able to do more work. You'll increase their efficiency, which is really just work over time, not that significantly different than strength. And the really fascinating thing is the muscle becomes more fatigue resistant. And so if you're lifting regularly or you're running regularly, with time and with practice, you can take those numbers we talked about, 4 to 6 seconds, 20 seconds, then you're anaerobic. You can take those times and you can actually extend them. You can lift longer without becoming sore as quickly. You can run further without becoming sore as quickly. And so that's a really cool piece of, might be the coolest piece of the results of exercising a muscle. So ordinary body movements I hope to do quickly because you learned them last chapter, but we do need to review them because you're going to hear them so much this chapter. Flexion, you decrease the angle of the joint, it brings two bones close together. Extension, opposite of flexion. Think flex the arm, extend the arm. Rotation is the movement of a bone in the longitudinal axis, like shaking the head no. Abduction and adduction. Abduction, lift away. Adduction, bring together. Circumduction, to make a circle. Flexion of the shoulder. Shoulder goes up this way. Extension of the shoulder. Shoulder goes back that way. Flexion at the knee. The shin, lower leg, goes back this way. Extension of the knee, it goes this way. Hyperextension of the shoulder, it goes past anatomical position. This is kind of weird. Okay, flexion of the neck, extension of the neck, hyperextension of the neck. Rotation, shaking, no. Rotation of the leg, point the foot out, it's lateral, point the foot in, it's medial. Abduction pulls the leg away from the midline. Adduction brings the arm in towards the midline. Circumduction, proximal end does not move. Distal end moves in a circle. That's circumduction. If we need to play Simon Says again in class, we certainly can, guys, to practice that. Okay, so with that, we have our energy and our actions, and that is where I wanted to get you for today. So thank you for your time.